Ooh, thank you. Usually doesn't work. Well, thanks a lot for being here. I'm welcoming you on behalf of the Corcoran Gallery, Museum, and College of Art and Design. It's just very nice to see you here. I'm really glad so many people turned out to hear Ellenzweig, and I'm really tempted to say that there hasn't been such a concentration of gayness in this room since, since Harvey Fierstein dined alone. Now is the time, please, to turn off your cell phones, or at least set them on stun. This is going to go on like this for just a couple of minutes, okay? I'm waiting while I see you actually turn them off, because most of the people don't, you know. My name is Bernard Welt. I teach in the Arts and Humanities Department and the BA Art Studies program here at the Corcoran. And let us just say I have always taken an interest in photography of men. I was something of a prodigy in this regard. It is literally a pleasure to introduce Ellenzweig. I mean by that I'm kind of getting sort of turned on. This may have something to do with the number of times that I anticipate using the word homoerotic in the next 2 minutes. This is not the first time I've said the word homoerotic in this room. I teach here. I said the word homoerotic several times yesterday. I know I said genitals and nude. I said, I don't know if there's anybody who was in that class, but I said masturbation about 8 times in this room yesterday. We were talking about Bill Condon's movie Kinsey from 2004, and I was trying to provide some historical context. I was talking about the reappearance in the Bush administration of a sort of set of usual suspects from the Reagan administration who had managed a very well-funded campaign to demonize Alfred Kinsey, sex education, scientific research, and to eradicate programs for the reduction of sexually transmitted disease, unwanted pregnancy, and the socio-sexual subordination of women and minors. And we were talking about how Condon's film about Kinsey was a counter-effort to marshal the audience's positive emotional response to a love story that's a sex story, presenting sexual diversity as inherent in nature's grand scheme of biological diversity. I think some of you remember that movie. Actually, what I was doing yesterday in this room was weeping. I always do when I see that movie. And when I talk about one of the last scenes in the movie, which you may remember, when Kinsey is interviewing a lesbian played by Lynn Redgrave, see, it starts to happen now, who comes out late in life, and she's talking to him about the difficulties of her life, and he says what a shame it is that social attitudes towards sexual diversity haven't really changed. And then she says, but they have. They've gotten much better. And he says, what happened? And she says, you did. You saved my life. So after reading his volume of research on the sexuality of women in the 1950s, she mustered the courage to declare her feelings to the love of her life, who reciprocated them, and had been living with her happily for years. You like a happy ending, so do I. So that's when I always cry, and whether I'm in front of a class or a group or not. Now, I don't make that grandiose acclaim for the homoerotic photograph, Alan Ellenzweig's historic survey, which practically defined the issues of genre, convention, historical influence, and social reception in erotically conceived images of males in the post-Stonewall era. I know it had a big impact on me. For one thing, leafing through the pages for the first time in 1992, I realized that I had been leaning way too heavily on the homo and not paying nearly enough attention to the erotic. I've said that Alan's book considered photography from a post-Stonewall perspective, but it may be more specifically accurate to call it a post-Mapplethorpe perspective. Since there may be young folks here who don't remember this story, I spend a lot of time in rooms like this with people who were born after 1989. I remind you, way back in the 80s, here in Washington, this institution canceled a scheduled exhibition of photographs by Robert Mapplethorpe, whose work features prominently in Alan's book. This is one of his pictures on the cover. when a senator from North Carolina, we don't say his name, threatened to use the exhibition as a pretext to cut off all funding to the National Endowment for the Arts. You're sitting in the room where the director of the Corcoran met with the students and faculty to discuss her decision to cancel the exhibition, and where we began making plans for protests, led by Washington artists like the great and indefatigable Bill Newman, who was one of the people responsible for those projections on the side of the building, you may recall. There was a lot of talk. There's always been a lot of talk. But it really came down to one question we wanted to ask. If you can't see the art of your time, how will you know what's going on? How will you know what people are feeling? How will you know how they see things? This question is perennially renewed in the critiques in our fine art photo and photojournalism programs and in the other classes held here. In my Sex in American Cinema course on Wednesday afternoons in the auditorium. And if there are any college professors in this audience and you're having any enrollment problems, let me just say, if you don't actually teach a Sex in American Cinema class, you might just drop the word sex and movies into your course description somewhere. It's amazing what happens. I think the question is renewed in the Corcoran's Shooting Stars exhibition opening on Saturday, which shows us how the vocabulary of Hollywood's glamour shots got into our heads and into the foundations of contemporary art traditions through that flashy, custom-built vehicle that we call Andy Warhol. But sometimes it's renewed with urgency in a moment of manufactured crisis, as when someone declares that gay artists are not a fit subject for an exhibition in a government-sponsored museum. It's a good question to ask, and it is a particularly significant one to ask regarding the art that is being produced right at this moment, and the art that is still in people's heads, waiting to come out, and art whose subject is invisible to most. We're here to celebrate the legacy of the homoerotic photograph and the 20th anniversary reissue of the homoerotic photograph, a work in which a critic accomplished with admirable depth, succinctness, and insight what only the best photographers manage to do, not just to show us what is there to be seen by anyone, but what we can't see. Not a scene, but a thought, not a body, but a feeling, not an object, but a way of experiencing the world and making the invisible visible. 25 years ago, Alan Ellenzweig was a member of the team that organized the historic 1988 documentary exhibition presented at City Hall's Tweed Gallery, The New York City Gay and Lesbian Community, World War II to the Present. He is a contributing writer to the Gay and Lesbian Review worldwide, very often actually, and has also written for Art in America, The Village Voice. This says Passion, but I imagine this is Passion, the magazine of Paris, and the online magazines Tablet and The Forward. He teaches in the writing program at the College of Mount St. Vincent in Riverdale, New York. Mr. Ellenzweig is a founding member and was president of the board of the Robert Giard Foundation, which awards the annual Robert Giard Fellowship to an artist working in photography, video, or film, and whose subject matter addresses issues of human sexuality, gender, and LGBTQ experience. He is currently researching just about the most interesting topic in photo history that I can think of, the life and work of the enormously influential photographer George Platt Lynes. The homoerotic photograph will, as you see, be available for purchase on this stage after the talk with the author in attendance. And I'd like to note that this program is being archived, so if after Alan speaks you have a question you'd like to raise, please signal to someone with a microphone. We will have attractive attendants circulating among you. Just do that. Please welcome our friend and colleague, Alan Ellenzweig.
Gee, I don't know if I can live up to that introduction. That's a good start. I'm going to start totally off topic. I just happened to see this in a footnote in Virginia Woolf's 3 Guineas, which I was reading some weeks ago. And Virginia Woolf writes, "The publication in book form is sufficient proof of the evil effect of an audience upon the lecturer intellectually. Psychologically, eminence upon a platform encourages vanity and the desire to impose authority. Well, I promise you I will try not to impose my authority, whatever it is. I am, in fact, humbled by Virginia Woolf's thought. And what I hope to do, at least I hope not too superficially, but at the same time not in great depth, is give you a sense of my conception of the homoerotic photograph, which I maintain it's not a style of photograph. The homoerotic photograph is a human event. It is a documentation of a human interaction that has either taken place between the figures in the photograph who are of the same sex. It could be that the interaction takes place between the photographer and his model. Or it could be that you, the viewer, experience an image as homoerotic regardless of what anyone else experiences of that very same image. So the homoerotic photograph is important because, for one thing, anybody can make a homoerotic photograph. The idea, especially promulgated at the time of the Mapplethorpe controversy, that only gay people made homoerotic photographs is entirely wrong. When you study the history, there are so many photographs that can fall within this category. I admit that I use a rather broad definition of homoerotic. Some of these images will not seem particularly erotic at all. They are in part about intimacy between men that may or may not culminate in an erotic interaction. But that intimacy, I tried to come up with a new word, homoempathic, except I thought that sounded too much like a medical procedure. Or homosociability, which is what the sort of queer theorists, I think, would use. I really do try to broaden the notion of what could fall into this category of the homoerotic. I'll start just with, obviously, the cover photograph. I'll return to this image. This is an image by Robert Mapplethorpe. But I will move immediately now to a little bit of history. And this is an image by Eugène Derieux. He was working with Eugène Delacroix, the painter. So Derieux and Delacroix posed the model. And by this time, this is around 1853, photographs already were being censored legally in some places. The problem with the photograph, of course, was its specificity, its reality, the fact that it wasn't necessarily an idealization of the man or the woman. Of course, most censored photographs, most obscene photographs, because that's the way they were, of course, viewed at the time, were images of women. Because the economy of pornography in the early to mid-19th century was an economy that was a male economy. Men made the photographs. They made them of women for other men to purchase. But nevertheless, there were always some images of the male nude. And here, what we have really is an image of someone who's no doubt a working-class Parisian. Perhaps he's a laborer, a butcher hauling slabs of beef. Maybe he was an acrobat. But his proportions are an allusion to classical forms, an allusion to that ideal manhood. And of course, he was so posed as a kind of aid for work that Delacroix would do eventually in either drawing from this image, perhaps preparation for some painting. But it is an image of the man as phallic champion, manhood, the ideal man, the beauty of the ideal man, the musculature of the ideal man. Of course, this is quite specific in that, you know, we're representing pubic reality. This could certainly have fallen into the category of the obscene, except that it was purely used for private purposes. I have a feeling I've moved too far ahead. Yes, okay. So I moved to the later 19th century. These, of course, this is one of a series of images of Eakins' students at the swimming hole. He used these as preparatory studies for a painting, which I will show you. And it happens that both the subject and these images in particular are perfectly equivalent to Walt Whitman's poem, which you may know, 28 young men bathed by the shore, 28 young men, and all so friendly. And it ends with, they do not think whom they souse with spray. Eakins was keenly invested in the athletic male, young men in the prime of their youth, bending, arching, swimming. In fact, these photographs may not be by Eakins himself. They may, in fact, be by one of Eakins' students, but nevertheless taken generally under his direction. And Eakins was acquainted with the motion studies of Edward Muybridge and, in this case, the Frenchman Etienne Jules Marie. And in those instances, Muybridge and Marie, what we have is the erotic subsumed under the banner of the scientific, under the banner of the motion study, so that this was one way in which you could sort of squeeze nudity into photography without it suffering or being in jeopardy of being called obscene or pornographic. Again, another one of the swimming hole photographs. And I maintain in the book, not so well here perhaps, that although these may not be about actual homosexual experience, there nevertheless is the whiff of that unfocused longing, the sort of garrulous interplay between young men, which in the nude swimming sometimes comes close to a kind of substitute erotic interchange. If we need to be clear that Eakins' intentions were indeed homoerotic, I think the painting proves the point. Not only is the painting organized and composed in a way that imitates pediment sculpture, that sort of triangular from the corner here to the top here to down around here. Whoops, sorry. That kind of arched, not arched, but angled composition imitates pediment sculpture from classical architecture. I think clearly the focus on the young man in the center, in particular on his backside, as if it was lit to glorify its beauty, tells us that the Eakins painting is an amalgam of ideas about classical beauty, the classical athlete, the figure on the left here is indeed a representation of the dying Gaul, a cast of which was at the Pennsylvania Academy. So this, by the way, was a commissioned painting, and when it was completed, it was, as it turns out, rejected by the person who commissioned it. So Eakins, I think, here idealizes in a way that the photograph can't. The photographs still maintain that kind of realism, pastoral though they may be, that the painting manages to transcend. And I include this mostly because it was in the Hide-Seek exhibition here in Washington about a year or so ago, and because Jonathan David Katz, in his catalog about it, wrote something that I think pertains as well to the previous painting. And in it, he says, "The crowd is not admiring the boxer's jab, but his buttocks. That the boxer was a working-class lad should also have given pause to the middle-class audience whose connection to the manly art of self-defense was less participatory than voyeuristic." Here we have an image by an English photographer named Frank Sutcliffe, who did many photographs, genre photographs, I think we could call them, of the town of Whitby in England. It was a fishing town, the ordinary, everyday experience of the people there. But in 2 or 3 cases, he focused his attention on male youths undressed by the shore. In fact, this was an image that he had seen enacted, but the young men were not undressed. So he managed to find several boys that he paid to undress for him and posed them in what I think quite clearly we could say, particularly with the figure on the left here, is a kind of imitation of classical Koroi, those beautifully modulated images of young men that were the standard representation of youth during the Athenian classical age. We move to Wilhelm von Gloeden. This is called Youth with Lotus Flowers from 1908. Of course, von Gloeden was working in Taormina, Sicily, using the young men of the town, posing them in quasi-classical garb, their heads arrayed with laurel wreaths and the like, in imitation of, the distant ephebe ideal, which is part of the revived Hellenic tradition at the turn of the century, among particularly, European aristocrats and Englishmen of a certain classical taste, let us say. Roland Barthes, the French philosopher, who appreciates von Gloeden's aesthetic, but nevertheless places it quite particularly as a kind of representation of a certain kitsch sensibility. He says, kitsch implies a recognition of high aesthetic values like taste, but adding that this taste could be bad, creating a contradiction or fascinating monster. And the fascinating monster is something that mixes sort of the vegetable grease, the togas. They're not meant to be absolutely historically accurate, but nevertheless, von Gloeden uses his young men against the backdrop of the Mediterranean in much the same way that Alma Tadema would in his paintings produced at roughly the same period. And these, curiously enough, are probably more historically accurate, at least in terms of the architecture. We move to F. Hollanday, who was a Boston photographer, Boston-based anyway. This is Nude with Lyre, 1907, and this is part of his Orpheus series. I would like to stress what I said before, that the homoerotic photograph is not a style. The style here is the style of pictorialism, which was the style of the period. This pictorialism was the attempt to certify photography as an art form by creating images that in some measure imitated the tonal richness of a drawing or a painting. And here, the Orpheus series evokes Orpheus, who was, of course, the charmer of the woodlands, whose song could tame wild beasts. Orpheus, you may remember, does not succeed in rescuing Eurydice from the underworld, and when Orpheus returns to his Thracian mountain home, he rejects all love of women to demonstrate, in fact, his faithfulness to his wife. Instead, he turns to the love of boys, which cannot be viewed as lessening his wedded faithfulness. And his songs, of course, glorify boys. But as Herbert Marcuse reminds us, the classical tradition associates Orpheus with the introduction of homosexuality. F. Hollanday also used Christian imagery to certify the male nude, which is, the second great motif that is used in the latter part of the 20th century, latter part rather of the 19th century, early part of the 20th century, to certify nudity as a legitimate, male nudity in particular, as a legitimate inquiry, artistic inquiry. You have classical illusion, which automatically removes the image from being suspect, but you also have Christian iconography, and here we have an image of a Saint Sebastian, presumably disguising the erotic subtext. This image, this portrait is of a young man, probably a young man of F. Hollanday's acquaintance from the Boston slums. Day was a philanthropist. He helped young men from the Boston slums. Whether there was an erotic component to this, I have not been able to judge. There is a new recent biography about Day, which has updated the scholarship, except my understanding is that the biographer has been very wary of forthrightly dealing with the homoerotic content of Day's photographs. Of course, an image like this, which is so tender and so lovely and so respectful of this young man's beauty and engages him in some, I would say, emotional exchange, represents also a long, now perhaps 50, 60-year history of boy love poetry that was widely honored in England ever since the example of Lord Alfred Tennyson's In Memoriam in the latter 1830s, I suppose, which was an homage to his friend Arthur Hallam, who had died early at the age of 22. A critic of the period, a pictorialist critic of the period, discusses F. Hollanday's individual code of beauty. I take this to be words that are letting us in on the fact that it was understood, at least by some people, that Day's individual code of beauty was also an individual sexual ethos. And indeed, Day, who was quite renowned in his time, he was next to Alfred Stieglitz, is among the most important pictorialists of the period. Nevertheless, Day was admonished for being a representative of the Oscar Wilde school of photography. We move now to the late 1920s, early 1930s, the adopted Parisian photographer Brassai. Here we have images that, instead of portraying the male nude as an erotic object, portray instead the social rights of a community that was already forming in Paris and in other capitals of Europe. So that we have here a young couple at the Bal de la Montagne Sainte-Geneviève in 1931. I think it's interesting to note that the couples in the background do not appear to be gay. So that we had a kind of bohemian Paris, an atmosphere in which it was permissible for two men to dance at a ball revealing their erotic interest in one another. And these images by Versailles represent what is probably the first survey of the sort of secret social rights of what we would now call the gay subculture. But I laud Versailles' camera for suspending judgment of his subjects. I would say that what Versailles has done is a kind of anthropology with the camera. And another image by Versailles. Here, what is the title happens to be a couple at the homosexual ball at Magic City, which I take to be a dance hall where gay people frequented. And you have, you know, a lesbian couple foregrounded, a gay couple in the background. But what is remarkable, I suppose, is how everyday they look. I mean, they look like anybody else. And there is nothing to distinguish them from other people except for the fact that they are two same-sex couples dancing with one another, with each other. Here we have the German photographer Herbert List, who worked throughout the 1930s, very often outside of Germany, which was not a congenial place for him. And this image, which I believe is simply titled Naxos from 1937, this image in some ways is representative of something that Liszt did often, twinning objects, twin men, twin trees. He often did photographs of twin objects like two pair of sunglasses at a beach side, as if those two identical images, those rather identical objects, were a sort of substitute for same-sex relations. Here, the photograph also represents a tradition in Germany which had been honored, certainly since the beginning of the 20th century, the tradition of Freundschaft, the ideal of friendship. Friendship between two men was something that didn't necessarily have to mean homosexual, but which also could have that character. I would, for those interested in knowing more about Liszt, besides the books that have been published of his images, there is a wonderful novel by Stephen Spender called The Temple, in which Herbert Liszt is represented by a figure named, of all things, Joachim Lenz, L-E-N-Z. Here, the sinuous, slender trees, I think, echo the long-limbed males. And once again, they remind me of a poem by Walt Whitman, who saw in Louisiana a live oak growing. But Whitman's tree stood alone there without a friend near. Liszt's trees arch toward the sun together. They decline in unison. Each one is the other's friend. And then we have also by Liszt a photograph called Amstrand from 1936, which I take to be a kind of sun-splashed version of Eakins's The Swimming Hole. We move to George Platt Lynes, a renowned figure of his time, the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, who was, among other things, the de facto official photographer of the New York City Ballet. And this is a portrayal from the Balanchine ballet Orpheus from 1950. Of course, on stage, the two models would not have been, the two dancers would not have been nude. Lynes was great friends of many dancers in the ballet company. And here we have depicted Francisco Moncion and Nicolas Magallanes, who I can only assure you, none of us is old enough here to know this, not having attended, but were really major dancers of their time. Another George Platt Lynes image, we could simply call this male nude, except that I happen to know that this model is a young man named Victor Kraft, taken when he was 17 years old, which may have been about the time he became the mignon, the lover, the sweetie pie, the main squeeze of the composer Aaron Copland. Here we have this figure existing in a kind of netherworld between here and there. Is he floating in air, in water? Lynes never wanted to adopt the category of surrealist, although many of his images are inflected by surrealism. And I think here we have a reminder of the work of someone who was not only a subject of his, but indeed a friend of his, of Cocteau. I think this is clearly a reminder of the sort of special effects that Cocteau used in films like La Belle et la Bête, Beauty and the Beast, and Orpheus, yet again, Orpheus. Okay, I shall move on to yet one more Lynes image. This is sort of classic Lynes, the studio nude, where Lynes had the extraordinary ability to depict the male nude as a sculptural entity living in space. And he did this through a kind of magical use of light. And I think this image does have a kind of magic to it. The way the light traces his shoulders, his hands, and his thighs. In fact, very often in Lynes, you never quite know where the light source is coming from. It seems to be coming from everywhere and nowhere. And a final image by Lynes, which depicts, this is actually just before wartime. Well, it may not be. This may have indeed been done during the war. It's an untitled image, and it I think demonstrates Lynes's remarkable theatrical lighting, where you have these high-key highlights, deep and imposing shadows thrown against the wall. In fact, I think in some ways Lynes anticipates the kind of lighting that we would see within the decade, but later in the decade, in film noir. Lynes clearly was influenced by Hollywood lighting, photographers like George Harrell, and he often photographs men and women in that kind of high sheen lighting that you get in Hollywood publicity stills. If George Platt Lynes didn't, photographed in the studio, and therefore his work is an example of the directorial mode of photography, where you create a vision inside an artificial environment. Here we have an image of man-to-man exchange done by a photojournalist named Charles Fenno Jacobs, who I have no reason to believe was himself gay. We have these guys, they're tattooing aboard the U.S. New Jersey. This is a Life magazine image. And Fenno Jacobs was recruited by Edward Steichen merely to portray the sort of everyday life of in the Navy. On another I'm sorry, I'm losing my place here. Yeah. And I think any of us who have read about the World War II experiences of gay men in Alan Barabay's Coming Out Under Fire will appreciate this kind of offhand intimacy that possibly leads to a deeper intimacy, but not necessarily. And I think for us, I mean, it's a beautifully composed image, but I think for us, we can imagine ourselves, if not in that time and place, but viewing from our own time and place the ambiguous intimacy that's taking place here. Here we have Minor White, Portland, 1940. White, again, somewhat like lines, uses a light source to throw a large shadow against the wall. This dark cinematic expressionism is also typical of film noir of the period of the late 40s. Peter Bonnell, who is a minor white expert, writes, "The men in these pictures are profoundly introspective. Their nakedness and their poses project aspects of both pathos and eros, and they become martyrs, saints of a kind." Minor white had a fair amount of difficulty coming to terms with his homosexuality, and at the same time was very much invested in the spiritual life. And I think that may be why Bonnell speaks as he does, or writes as he does. I think I passed something by, I'm sorry. Portland, 1939. Merely, I would say, minor white using his camera to cruise the streets. And here, an unusually frank image of two men, not frank because it's so sexual, but frank because they're so identifiable. In the late 1940s, a time when being out as a homosexual was not a small matter. Of course, many of the images that would fall into the homoerotic category by White were not shown in their time. This is by Edmund Teske. I don't have very much to say about this. I just recently discovered this image online on the internet. But I do think of it as a kind of cinema verite image, something as if, a cameraman, a Hollywood cameraman had gone outdoors to film a scene, and we don't really know what's happening between these two men. We can't know. But something seems to be happening. I don't know what it is. This is by a female photographer. Yes, a female photographer can make a male homoerotic image. Amurica Sendas, Sailors, Key West, 1966. When I called Amurica Sendas to ask permission to use this, she said, "Oh, gee, do you think that's homoerotic?" I said, "Ms. Casindus, I assure you, every gay man I have shown this to says this is homoerotic." And it reminds me of something W.H. Auden wrote, which I use several times in the book. Auden writes, "It is not an accident that many homosexuals should show a special preference for sailors, for the sailor on shore is symbolically the innocent god from the sea, who is not bound by the law of the land and can therefore do anything without guilt." Here we have a Dwayne Michaels image. I will read you the caption only because I think how interesting it is that the word that cannot be said, well, I'll say it afterward. Certain things must be said. Things had become impossible between them and nothing could be salvaged. Certain words must be said. And although each one had said those words 100 times to herself, they had never had the courage to say them out loud to one another. So they began to hope someone else might say the necessary words for them. Perhaps a letter might arrive or a telegram delivered from some stranger that might say what they couldn't. Now they spent their days waiting. What else could they do? Well, Michaels always lauds himself, and with good reason, on trying to photograph that which cannot be seen. And here I think what cannot be seen is the same thing that cannot be said: love. Here I would say, this maybe should fall into the category of a heteroerotic photograph. After all, it's a vision of paradise regained, Adam and Eve. The trappings of contemporary life disappear as we return to our natural state. But notice that it's Adam's nudity which is foregrounded. And this is an image, another image by Dwayne Michaels, in which sex and death are twinned. And I believe this image was created, I don't have the date in front of me, but I believe it's from the 1980s when AIDS was already beginning to impress itself in our daily life. the Mapplethorpe Dennis Walsh, New York City, 1976. Mapplethorpe, didn't need the excuse of classical references or Christian themes. The beautiful man was reason enough to take a photograph. Of course, his images are also, they're highly formal, the darkness of the darks, the whiteness of the whites. Mapplethorpe is our chief homoerotic formalist, creating images that are appreciated as much for their formal inventiveness as for the implicit and sometimes explicit homoeroticism that they convey. Here we have Agito, an image which is one of 4 from 1981. Janet Carden said of this, of Mapplethorpe's male nudes, they are figures so volumetric, occupying their space so convincingly that the photographer might be holding a chisel instead of a camera. But Mapplethorpe is also ransacking the history of images. This, of course, is the well-known Jean-Hippolyte Flandrin's Young Man by the Seashore, 1836. And I return to F. Hollanday merely to show you that the African-American male nude had been used previously, and also in a